Surrogacy is a process where one woman carries a baby for somebody else. When the surrogate gives birth, she is the legal mother. Their mindset going through that pregnancy is very different. They're going to be giving the baby back to somebody else, so it's not sort of handing the baby over, it's actually returning the baby. One of the things surrogates always say to us is that they're really worried that the intending parents won't want the baby.
Hi, welcome to Changing Suits. My name's Bal.
And my name's Taj.
Okay, so today we will talk about a topic that we haven't ever spoken about. And we've got a guest here who is Dr. Vasanti Jadva, who is a reader in psychology in City, the University of London. That's how she told me to say it. And also has honorary positions in Cambridge and UCL. Hi, Vasanti, how are you today?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, doing well. I haven't mentioned what the topic is. So today's topic is going to be surrogacy. Now, one really important point is, what is surrogacy?
Yeah, so surrogacy is one of those words, I guess, everyone thinks they know what it is, and then when I explain it, often they've not heard about it. So surrogacy is a process where one woman carries a baby for somebody else. And in surrogacy can be done in different ways as well. So we can have what we might call sort of gestational surrogacy, where the surrogate is gestating an embryo that's not genetically related to her, or there's traditional surrogacy where the surrogate might use her own egg for the pregnancy. And in terms of who she's carrying the baby for, it can either be a heterosexual couple, it can be a gay couple, it might be a single man. And in this country, surrogacy is legal, and we do have couples and single people using surrogacy.
Just a quick question there. When you said in this country it is legal, is there countries obviously that it's not legal in then?
Yeah, actually, in most countries, it's not legal. Yeah, so it's if you look globally, surrogacy, the legislation for surrogacy varies quite a lot, and how it's regulated in terms of whether people can use it in their own country, whether they're traveling overseas, can also differ. So in this country, yes, you can do surrogacy here, but a lot of people also travel overseas for surrogacy because for various reasons that we can go into.
Just touching on some of the reasons, why isn't it allowed in certain countries?
So it's seen as quite there's lots of different reasons. It's seen as quite a controversial method of conception. It's sometimes it's not allowed because there are concerns around exploitation of women, for example, and that's sometimes reasons why surrogacy, where it has sometimes been used, is sometimes shut down because there are concerns about the way in which it's practiced. So it can really vary in terms of legislation. So in some countries there are just no laws for it at all, and in some countries there are laws that specify that it's not allowed, and in others it is allowed, but there might be specifications on the type of surrogacy that's allowed. So they may, for example, allow gestational surrogacy but not traditional surrogacy.
What is just, I'm going to be really layman, what is just, I can't even say the word.
So unfortunately there are different terms used for the different types of surrogacy as well, which doesn't make it easier either. But more recently, sort of the publications that I've been writing and more sort of familiar terms would use gestational surrogacy, where the surrogate doesn't use isn't genetically related to the child that she's carrying. So the embryo is either using donor gametes or the gametes from the intending parents. The intending parents is the term that we often use to describe the parents who have sort of initiated the surrogacy and who will then be raising the child. So there's different terms kind of used in surrogacy, but unfortunately the terms are not the same, and they can vary by country as well, just to sort of...
Is there a test that you can actually say the words, I'm not even going to bother saying it, before you go in?
Taj wouldn't pass, so that hopefully there's not.
I wouldn't. I think the easiest way to sort of to talk about the two different types of surrogacy is surrogacy where the surrogate uses her egg, and surrogacy where she doesn't. And that's kind of how you can think about the two different ways that surrogacy is practiced.
I like it simple.
Now, it's interesting because this is the second time we've tried to record this, so we sort of jumped straight into something else. But one thing that we did pick up when we tried it last time was the fact that surrogacy, I didn't know what surrogacy actually was until what we've seen on, or what Taj has been watching on the Kardashians. And don't think bad of her though. But it did bring up a question of how media is so important in any aspect
Awareness. Mm.
awareness of it. So with the surrogacy, has it become easier to go through the process now with the awareness that is out there, or has it always been a very easy situation to get into and start going through the process?
Yeah, so I would say surrogacy isn't the easiest process to go through. It's actually really challenging in lots of different ways, actually. So for for heterosexual couples who are going through IVF, for example, there are lots of clinics you can go to, lots of familiarity around how it's done. Surrogacy is far less practiced, so there's fewer people who know how surrogacy is done, either thinking about that within the UK context or internationally. So it's one of the harder things to navigate. Of course, you're also relying on somebody else carrying a baby, which of course can be quite stressful, quite anxiety provoking as well. So it's by no means easy to go through a surrogacy arrangement. But you touched on something quite important there about the media and sort of media portrayals around surrogacy as well. So some of the surrogates that we speak to do talk about how surrogacy is now much more familiar. So 20 years ago, when people used to ask them about their pregnancies because they can see they're pregnant, and they might ask them about when the baby's due, and they would say that, oh, this isn't my baby, and that would also give quite confused looks from people. It's sort of, well, what do you mean it's not your baby? You're pregnant with a baby, and whereas now they can say, oh, I'm a surrogate, and then often the person they're talking to kind of understands what that means. And so it's a lot less explaining that they need to do, and not in all cases, but certainly it's a much more familiar term. And partly that's been because, like you say, celebrities coming forward and sharing their stories of having babies through surrogacy as well. So it's certainly more familiar, but I don't think it's any easier. I think it's still a challenging thing to go through.
How long has surrogacy been around then?
So that's a really difficult question, because surrogacy, if we think about the two different types of surrogacy, if we're thinking about the surrogate using her own egg, then actually the treatment doesn't need to go through a clinic as such. It can be artificial insemination at home, for example, so a far less invasive procedure. So that can go back.
On that point, can I just clarify? Is it basically they can have sex at home with or how would that work?
So it can be through sex, but actually it can be artificial insemination. So using using
I was like, shall I say anything? Yeah.
you could so you would use something like a syringe to inseminate yourself at home with the semen. So that's how
those films that you see when they have the paste, whatever it's called.
the is often the term that's used. Yeah, I have to say that this is far less used now. I mean, now people would go to a clinic because obviously then you've got the tests and the screening and things would happen with the sperm sample as well. So if you're having any form of surrogacy treatment, you would tend to go to a clinic now to make sure that you've got the screening and things in place as well.
I need to clarify. I just haven't. Okay, so if you're at home, how would you?
I was going to say, Bal's going to try this at home.
I'm a bit confused. So injections, you'd inject the semen in?
Yes, you would just as in you would just use either like a turkey baster or something similar to self inseminate.
I thought that was a joke, to be honest.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
So, I mean, like I said,
we're like, oh, okay, we've learned something really new.
In the context of surrogacy, at least, it was far more used previously. But I mean, it is still a treatment that is used by people now, even having a child. I'm not going to go into some of the other types of families that I study and things, but actually, people meeting people online, for example, to have a child with them who don't want to have sexual intercourse but still want to have a genetic child together may use a method like that outside of a clinic setting. So it still does occur. But I would say with surrogacy, increasingly people do go through clinics to have treatment now.
Why would you go to a clinic?
Sorry.
Why would you go to the clinic? Oh, you were saying about tests and stuff that you can do.
Yeah, so the sperm can then be screened and checked. and it's all done in a much more managed kind of way as well. So that's why you would try to go through a clinic. And so yeah, to come back to what you were saying about how long it's been going on for, those sorts of things can be going on, historically, for some time. Whereas actually the gestational surrogacy, where the surrogate doesn't use her own egg, is only been made possible with the introduction of IVF, because it's essentially the same procedure that's used, but instead of the embryo being put back into the mother who's going to be raising the child, it's put into the surrogate that would gestate the baby.
I feel like today's a lot of pennies are dropping. Like, oh, okay.
I feel like I've been shocked into silence with the way you do it at home, so I will bring myself out of that. Okay, in regards to the psychological effects, because if someone decides to be a surrogate, that's a pretty big deal. I mean, I've had conversations. I mean, I was watching Friends the other day, and they had that episode of when Phoebe decides to be a surrogate for her brother. And is that quite a common way of doing it? Do people who want to be parents tend to go to friends or relatives? Is that how it works usually?
It can vary. So in our studies, we have had a mixture of the kind of relationships, the pre-existing relationships that have been there between the parents and the surrogate. So yes, in some cases, it can be a family member or a friend who's acting as a surrogate. And in other cases, they've met the surrogate through a third party, and that might be a surrogacy organisation. We have several surrogacy organisations currently in the UK that can support parents with their surrogacy journeys. Or it might be they've met through a mutual friend. So, where you happen to know that there's somebody there who actually wants to be a surrogate, and then you happen to meet somebody who's looking for a surrogate, and they might put them in touch. And that has happened in some of the couples that were taking part in our study.
Taj, no, wait, I've got 101 questions. So, sorry, you're going to have to wait.
Go on.
Okay, so a few things. In regards to the legalities, would they need to have a legal contract? That's my first question, but I'm going to give you all the questions all in one go. Is there a legal contract? Because I can see, like, if I was if I was a parent that wanted to be a parent, I'd want to make sure that I did get that child. That's the first question. Is there a financial implication as well? So do people pay for a surrogate? Those are just two questions, then we'll go on to the others afterwards.
We'll go on to the others later. Okay. So the first one you can make a sort of an agreement with your surrogate, and actually some of the surrogacy organisations will help you do that, just to sort of lay out what happens in different scenarios, for example. But these are not legally binding contracts in the UK, at least. And there's been lots of discussion around the way in which surrogacy is governed. And there's been new legislation that has been drafted that hasn't come into effect yet. But if anyone's interested, they can get more information about this on the website. The Human Fertilisation Embryology Authority has lots of information on their website about surrogacy. They can also go to the different surrogacy organisations' websites as well, which are all linked off the HFVA website as well. And they can also read some of the draft proposals that will be coming in as well. So surrogacy laws in this country were drafted some time ago and are considered to be a bit out of date, especially with the numbers of surrogacy that are now taking place, which are in relative terms are still small, but they still do affect more and more people each year. So that was your first question, was about the contract. I think the second one you said about payment, and again, there's going to be changes to sort of, so you can't pay a surrogate to be a surrogate in this country. It has to only really cover expenses that the surrogate incurs, or the amount that she's given has to go through a court of law. So it's not, so I guess, well, to answer your question, it's a bit confusing in terms of the payment amount. They wouldn't call it payment, they will call it reasonable expenses. But like I said, in this country, currently as the law stands, it's either reasonable expenses or the amount needs to be approved by a court of law. So if you are giving a larger sum of money, which sometimes would be the case if you're going overseas for surrogacy, then those payments do need to be approved when you come back. But again, the legal side of things, if you're interested, it's best to kind of go on to these websites and read it up for yourself. So there's been lots of concern also by the fact that in this country, when the surrogate gives birth, she is the legal mother. It's not automatically the case that the parents who have commissioned the pregnancy are the legal parents at birth. Again, something that they're hoping to change moving forward as well with the new legislation coming in.
Oh God, there's so many emotions, and I'm feeling I don't know how wow. What if financially, the people don't go to the court and the surrogate doesn't ask for the extra amount, etc.? Why would she want to be a surrogate?
Yeah, so we've done studies with surrogates. We've asked them the questions of why do you want to enter into a surrogacy arrangement? And actually, the most common thing they say is that they just want to help other people. Often they've had children themselves. They've got really nice relationships with their own children, really strong sense of family with them, and they want to make sure somebody else can also have that. So that's really the main reason why the
Oh, I was just a helpful person. That's another whole level, though, isn't it? That's amazing.
I mean, it is quite amazing when you think about the commitment as well, like how much time they've got to give in order to do that as well, and also the toll it can take on their own family. So one of the things we've done is also spoken to the children of surrogates to ask them how they felt about their mums being surrogates. Seeing their mums being pregnant and then giving the baby to somebody else, and actually the children of surrogates that we spoke to, they were all aged over 12, because we didn't speak to very little ones, but they all were really just proud of their mums and were just really supportive of the fact that that their mums could do that and do that for somebody else.
But they probably already understand the whole situation because you wouldn't be, oh, this is our baby, we're going to keep the baby. They'd already would have had those conversations and been. I suppose you can never be ready for anything, but like this is going to go to another family, and they must have sat down and had those talks. So it wouldn't have been a shock for the children.
Yeah, and that's what you've mentioned is a really key factor actually when we talk about surrogacy is the intention for the surrogates to be carrying a baby that they know from the outset isn't their baby. And so their mindset going through that pregnancy is very different to, because some of them would have had pregnancies of their own as well. And they do talk about how, they are carrying this baby for somebody else. They're going to be giving the baby back to somebody else. So it's not sort of handing the baby over, it's actually returning the baby. And those are the kind of the ways in which they would think about the pregnancies. So yes, I think the intention there is really important, and the fact that
I
they
think
know
that's amazing. It is really amazing for any woman to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking back at being pregnant and how much it definitely takes its toll. So it's a whole other level of trying to help people. It really is. Yeah. That
But
is
then
amazing.
different women handle and different bodies can handle things in different ways. You know, so maybe because you have women that can have 20 babies and they're still going and they look fitter than me after having two. So it's about how the body copes with it as well.
But then I don't know, it's really tough psychologically. Have you come across cases where, well, I'm sure there has been cases where the person has changed their mind and said, well, legally it's their baby, um, right now in the
Yeah, so
in the
in our
legal sense.
study, all of the surrogates would have given the baby to the intending parents who were being raised by the intending parents. But there have been sort of media coverage of cases where there have been sort of disagreements between surrogates and intending parents. But they do seem to be rare. If you think about how many surrogacy arrangements take place, we don't hear about as so many sort of you know uh, so many arrangements where there's a breakdown in relationship to the extent where it would end up sort of the surrogate wanting to keep the baby. In fact, one of the things surrogates always say to us is that they're really worried that the intending parents won't want the baby. So that's a bigger concern for them, is that actually they really want to make sure that that the intending parents will want the baby at the end of the day. And from intending parents' perspectives, their concern is that the surrogate will want to keep the baby. So if you think about the two sides of it, they're often concerned about the other, but in reality, it usually does work out okay.
And tell us the numbers. So you said that it's a very low number of people that do it. Well, how many people do go through surrogacy, and what kind of numbers are we talking about now?
Yeah, so the numbers are also tricky to understand in a way. So when you've done surrogacy, to get legal parentage of your child, you would apply for something called a parental order. And it's a process that would happen once the baby is born. And then there's a record kept of those. So that's one of the ways in which we look at the numbers of surrogacies taking place, is how many parental orders have been granted. And roughly now, they're sort of around the 400, 450 per year mark. So that's what I mean. In relative terms, they're actually quite small when you think about how much IVF is happening, for example, in the UK, which is much higher. But that's been a steady increase. And also when you break down those numbers to sort of how many are happening in the UK versus how many are overseas, there's almost like a 50-50 shift. That sort of around about half would happen abroad as well.
So only 400 surrogacies worldwide then you're talking about, rather
No,
than just the UK?
I'm talking only about the UK. Worldwide, I mean, there would be no statistics to understand worldwide what's happening. But the reason why it's complicated even within the UK is because not everybody applies for a parental order. So especially maybe in cases where they've gone overseas, they may not come back and do the parental order process as well. So that's why, we're not entirely sure exactly how many surrogacy births are happening, but the parental order gives us some guidance.
But then the parental order, where you had that legality of that baby would essentially be that surrogate's mother, that would then, I'm assuming the parental order is that, well, no, I'm the parent going forward. Is that correct in assuming
That's right,
that?
yeah. It transfers the parentage from the surrogate to the intending parents moving forward. And it's a really important thing to do. And I think sometimes in cases where people have gone overseas, they've not realised that they need to do a parental order when they return. So actually understanding that that's a really important part of the surrogacy arrangement is key as well, I think.
So in the case of when you're not using the parent's egg, why wouldn't that be called an adoption rather than a surrogacy? I don't know if that makes sense, because you're using someone else's egg, it's
And
their
the
child,
sperm
and
would
you're
still,
adopting.
but the sperm would still be the father's, I'm assuming. Is
But
that
then the
correct?
mother would adopt.
But then you've got them as a step parent. Now,
I was having a bit of a
let me explain it to you. Go for it. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think it all falls under the umbrella of fertility treatment. So it's all governed through the HFE and regulated through the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority. Adoption is a separate entity altogether. It's governed differently. There's different processes in place for that as well. So they're just two completely different ways of having children, I guess. And surrogacy falls under the fertility treatments that you can access.
But then that is an interesting point. Does it that's really interesting. Are we correct in saying that when the surrogate, it's the surrogate's egg, the sperm would be of the intended
Partner.
father, I guess. Is that correct?
It can be, it can be. So again, with the parental order currently, and actually for moving forward, the way it's going to work is that if it's a couple, one of them have to have used their own gametes in order for the surrogacy. That's not always the case if you think globally. Like sometimes it could be a donor embryo or donor gametes. But actually in the UK, they have retained, and it is currently the case that one of the people who will be raising the child has to be genetically related to the child in order to apply for the parental order.
All of a sudden, I'm really feeling for the Kardashians. They went through a lot to get to where they got to. Sorry, Taj.
And have you ever done any research of, for example, if they get divorced, what happens is just the normal process of what you would do with, I'm probably not going to use the right terminology, to be honest, what would happen with your child, or has there ever been any cases where they're like, actually, this isn't my child?
So in the case of the couple who are, again, talking about our research, the couples who are raising their children, they were both parents of that child. So it would just go to how it would have happened, regardless of whether or not they'd use surrogacy, if you like. There have been cases in the media of breakdowns in relationships between couples when they're going through a surrogacy arrangement. Of course, that can be really difficult for everybody involved, and it can end in different ways. But in our research, at least, it's very much the case that the couples that have been bringing up the babies are the parents of the child, and that there's no question about that, and certainly the gametes and things don't really come into play. So even if it's a surrogate's egg that's used, it's still the parents. The parents are still the parents who are raising the child are still the parents.
And is there... Go on, Bal.
We've got so many questions.
Oh my God!
Whole another topic. Go on, Taj. Sorry.
So is there any breakdown in ethnicity of the data that you've got?
So most of the families who are taking part in our study, so we did a longitudinal study with heterosexual couples who had had a child through surrogacy. And we've been following up those families for 20 years now, actually. So we saw when the children were born, and we've just seen them when they're not longer children, they're young adults at the age of 20. Most of those families are white, Caucasian ethnicity. We do have some ethnic minority parents in our study, but they certainly are a minority. They're certainly in smaller numbers.
And why do you think that is?
Yeah.
Or is it because they're not registering and so we don't know that it's happening?
So I think, like I said, our study, that longitudinal study started 20 years ago when there was far fewer surrogacy arrangements happening than there are now, roughly around 50 per year compared to the over 400 that we're saying that we see now. So I think that has something to do with it. I think also, ethnic minority South Asian people are using surrogacy. And we know that from some of the more recent surveys that we've conducted, where we've looked at people's motivations, for example, for going abroad for surrogacy. We've had different ethnic groups take part in those studies. So we know that it is something that they are doing. But often they're having to travel overseas for it. And now I think there's more research to sort of understand if they've tried in the UK and not been able to find their surrogates in the UK, perhaps if they're looking for a surrogate of the same ethnicity, perhaps. But certainly it is done within the South Asian community. But like I said, the numbers are so small that it's likely that you might not know somebody who's done surrogacy because the numbers are quite small. That doesn't mean it's not happening.
Why would they go abroad rather than do it here?
Yeah,
Because
so
I'm
there's
assuming if the people on the register, for example, I'm assuming a lot of them will be Caucasian. They will be white people that are on a large number of white people rather than South Asian people, because that tends to happen in anything that we're talking about. But what is it that because they could use those surrogates who might not be of the same ethnicity? Is that correct in saying that?
of course, yeah.
Okay, so why did they decide to go to a different country in that case?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure if there's I think we need to just pull back a bit. So in terms of people going abroad for surrogacy or staying in the UK, there are people of all ethnicities doing both. Is the thing to say. So people do stay in the UK, people do go overseas for surrogacy. In terms of why they might be going abroad for surrogacy, some of the reasons that they've given to us in our research is, for example, there being a shortage of surrogates. So there aren't very many women on the books for the different surrogacy organisations. So there's a long waiting list to be able to find a surrogate. Sometimes it's to do with cost as well. So and it's a mixture of sort of availability of surrogates as well as costs involved. Sometimes it's to do with the legal framework, the fact that they're uncomfortable with the fact that it would be the surrogate that's the legal mother at birth. If they go overseas, it's not always the case. They may be able to be registered on those birth certificates from the outset, for example. So there are lots of reasons why they might go abroad. And I think one of the things that we found in our research is that they're not really making a choice as such. It's not they're choosing to stay here or they're choosing to go to a particular destination. Often it's about what's available to them, what their budget is, what's available to them, what can they afford to do, and what the barriers are as well within the state for staying in the UK. So there's lots of different factors that can impact why somebody ends up having surrogacy where they end up having it. And it's not, sometimes it's sort of think about, well, you just choose a destination or you choose where you're going to do it and then you just go ahead and do it. And the reality is that it's not always like that. It is a weighing up of these different factors.
In regards to the psychological aspect or the intended parents, what state of mind are they in prior to going through the process of surrogacy? Because where you said surrogacy is very low when you compare it to people trying naturally and IVF, and I'm sure there's other processes that I don't know, but it is quite low. So what are the mental states before, and then during, and then even afterwards?
Yes, again, the research on this is actually really limited. There haven't been very many studies, particularly doing what you're saying, which is following them up from preconception through the pregnancy to afterwards. There's very few studies that have actually done that. So we know very little in terms of psychological state and how that might change. We know that surrogacy can be a stressful process, and some of the survey work that I did, where we did have groups of parents at different stages of the surrogacy, did sort of talk about the stress and anxiety that it caused. You know, the and that can be at all stages of it. So thinking about where they're going to do surrogacy, how they're going to do surrogacy, to when the surrogate is pregnant, thinking about anything that might go wrong, for example, worries about the pregnancy at that stage, to after the birth of the baby as well. So there can be different points at which they can feel the sort of the stresses, I guess, of going through the arrangement. In terms of once the baby's born, from our longitudinal study at least, we found that these families do really well. They have really good parent-child relationships. The children are really well adjusted, and the children themselves can explain surrogacy to us from as young as 10. They know that they were carried by somebody other than their mum, and even when they're older, they talk about it being something that actually they feel quite, it's something about them, but that it doesn't really define who they are as such. So these families actually function really well.
From a South Asian perspective, sorry, Tad, I know you're going to come in. From a South Asian perspective, what is because we talk about a lot of taboo topics within the South Asian community. Would you classify surrogacy as a taboo topic, or would you say actually, well, it's not really well, I don't know. Is it a taboo topic within the South Asian community?
Yeah, I think that's probably a question for you both to answer as well. I think. I mean, from my perspective, I think infertility can be quite a big taboo in South Asian communities, and again, it's an area that we don't know much about. Not much research has been done on infertility, but certainly, I think with surrogacy, because lots of people don't know anybody who's gone through surrogacy, it can therefore be quite an isolating process. I think if somebody is making that decision because others might not understand it or might not really understand the science behind it or how it's actually going to happen and have their worries of their own. So I think lots of fertility treatments can be taboo within the South Asian community. But again, I just don't think there's been enough research looking at it. But what do you think?
I think, in India, and for years, people have, for example, if a couple can't have a child, sometimes they have the child of their brother or sister, and I don't think it was a big issue. It just happens because it's your brother or your sister.
I feel like it was socially. I think you're right in where you said,
And the families were all together, living together, so
well, I think you're right in saying, look, the infertility is the taboo topic. What you've just said there, Taj, I think this is actually more socially accepted in the South Asian community in regards to surrogacy. But again, I think the awareness, because we're throwing 101 questions because we don't know very much about surrogacy, which is why I'm like, okay, technically, how does this work, and da 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 da. But I feel like it's socially accepted because, like, well, if you can't have a child, then why not do that? What do you think about that? From both of your points of view, because we're all South Asian women here, so we've all got an experience in this.
Something shall I let you go first?
Yeah, you both into silence.
Yeah, like I said, from a research perspective, we just don't know enough we don't know enough about it, and unfortunately, there haven't been very many. So even when we do surveys or whatever, there aren't very many South Asian perspectives in terms of the respondents who are taking part as well. So
what do you think from a South Asian woman as yourself, and you know the background aside from your research, because we're well aware that the research is very
yeah, I think that's what I'm saying. I know that infertility itself can be quite a taboo subject. It can be something that can also be quite isolating, I think, for people, because there are expectations around family and around having children and also sort of and also we don't really talk about fertility. We don't really talk about that as much. So I think it is a difficult I think it's a difficult thing to go through. I think it's difficult for everybody, but I think for the South Asian community, within the South Asian community, all these different types of treatments that are now available as well. The use of donor gametes, for example, is something that you might not want to share with others. You might be concerned about how other people will think about that as well. So there are lots of things that might be more taboo. I think with surrogacy, surrogacy was huge in India. It was really, there were lots of surrogacy hospitals offering surrogacy in India. One of our PhD students, who's now a researcher based in Dubai, Nishta Lamba, did her PhD with us, looking at the experiences of surrogates in India, and of course, it's done very differently there. But it is quite a familiar. It is like I said, it's much more familiar in terms of what surrogacy is, and also it's been picked up by, I think there was a Bollywood film about surrogacy as well. So a lot more awareness about what surrogacy is. So I think you're right. There's probably going to be differences in terms of how acceptable the different types of treatments are. And I think it's really important to actually do more research to understand why that is. If that's the case, is it the case that some treatments are seen as more acceptable than others? And why might that be? And for people who are doing the treatments themselves, to actually understand what their experiences have been of having a child, through the different ways in which they do it, and what information they share with the child, with others, and if they see any sort of barriers to that as well.
Would you say in that case, because it has, from the sounds of what both of you have said there, it's been done for years, it's become socially acceptable in the South Asian community. I feel like with this topic, and it happens very rarely, we're actually, those countries are slightly more progressive than than the West, I guess, with surrogacy.
Well, so India was a big destination for surrogacy, but they did change their laws around it. So they've actually shut down surrogacy for foreign couples or foreign people. So as a foreigner, you
People
can.
don't take advantage of.
Sorry?
Why have they done that? Is that so people don't come in and take advantage of people in the
Yeah,
country?
yeah, exactly. They were seen as concerns around the exploitation of women and the way that the surrogates are being treated, for example. So that they changed their legislation a few years ago. But surrogacy, like I said, we did do that study of surrogacy in India, and those surrogates, some of them we've gone back to see 5 years later, and they talk about how actually the money they received, because in India they did receive money, actually did help them. And they allowed them to either buy a better place for their families, and so yes, there's these sort of two sides. So of course, we don't want to be exploiting women or making them do things they don't want to do, but on the other hand, the women who were doing it, and they were changing their lives and improving them in some way.
Do you know what? This is genuinely a really interesting topic, especially now we've hit on these topics of how far back did it go, especially within those South Asian countries, and it's quite an eye opener. Just this whole the process and the history behind it.
Yeah, and I think it's also quite confusing. Like, it's when you think about sort of how surrogacy is practiced internationally, it's a whole other sort of ball game as well. Really hard to keep track of, which countries are allowing it, which ones have stopped, where people are going to. It can be quite a daunting thing to navigate, I think, for people. So we are fortunate here in this country, at least, that we do have organisations that can support people here going through it. Living in some countries where there isn't access to surrogacy, it's much harder.
Perfect. As we come to the end of this episode, what advice would you give someone that is considering surrogacy? Where do they go? Who do they go to? And again, on the psychological side, what advice would you give them?
Yeah. So I think really connect with a surrogacy organisation, because they do have the experience and the expertise to support you with your journey. You can, like I said, you can find details of the surrogacy organisations on the HFEA website, where you can also learn more about surrogacy in the UK as well. So I think definitely use the help of a surrogacy organisation, because they'll also have access to counsellors, for example, who can help you, with your journey too. And I think it is important to be able to discuss how you're feeling about it, and just to get that support from the outset as well. So yeah, that would be my advice, is to actually seek out some information, but make sure you're supported with your journey.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been like I said, a real eye opener. And once we've pressed stop, I've got another few questions for you as well. So the listeners are going to miss out. We're going to have to add an extra bit to this. But it's been really insightful. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Perfect. That's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Follow us on Instagram and Facebook, changing_suits, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.